We've heard a lot about the growing competitive threat from retail funds, particularly if the changes to the default system go through. So not-for-profit and industry funds have to rely on their brand to express their value and their point of difference. So what then is the role of the brand? Right now we know that some people mightn't be able to tell you what brand they're in, what their super is all about. They're completely disengaged. It is not, as the woman in the video put it, cool to talk about. So how can brands be developed based on existing cultures? How do you communicate it to your members, and how does that all help when members are asked to make a choice about which brand or fund to go with? So before I introduce our speakers, I'm told that there is a question. How important is the strength of your brand to the success of your organisation? Huge, kind of, not all. I like that. It's like talking in haiku poetry. So while you answer that question, I will introduce the members of the panel. On my far right, Hannah McCard is the Senior Accounts Director at Millward Brown. All they do at Millward Brown is brands. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Brands and communication.
Brands. Mark Saraf is the National Head of Strategy at Ogilvy Australia, a big advertising company, but apparently they do more than, remember Darren and Durwood on Bewitched, storyboard and ads? Apparently they've got to do context these days. Is that right, Mark?
If we can figure out how to do it, yes.
And finally, Carrie Cousins is the Head of Technology, Corporate and Public Affairs at Burson Marsteller Australia, crafting strategy and narratives for public and private sector around change programs and education. Does that mean working out how to communicate ideas?
That's exactly what it means.
Terrific. All right, we have the results of the survey here. Huge, 85%, 15% or not at all. Oh. Still. Carrie, is that like asking people, should you eat green vegetables? Yes. There's 3 people working here in brands, and so they say, yes, you should do it. Is that the result that you would have expected?
Yeah, it is. I think the super industry is at a really interesting stage because you've got consumers and then ultimately the decision that they make to go with a particular fund. And in between at the moment, or traditionally really, you've had a bit of a black box that's kind of impenetrable, it's not very transparent, and that's been the traditional approach that funds have been taking to communicate to their members. But now, I think we were talking about this on the phone, you know, people are a lot more informed, and they also have a lot more avenues to get information about the funds that they choose or how they invest their money. That's from everything from crowdsourcing to crowdfunding to, you know, really the commercialization of super, which is that you walk into an office, and it used to be that your company would say, here's our fund, and you would say, yeah, sure, whatever, I don't even know what super really is. But now people aren't doing that anymore. So there's this huge opportunities for funds to open up that black box and really start talking about what you stand for. Not the fact that, hey, these sources aren't very credible, which is where I think actually too much time is being spent at the moment. It should be focused on, here's why you should go with us, and here's what we stand for, and here's why our values align with your personal values.
And so, I mean, you do similar work as well, Mark, but if you were to take on the super industry as a whole or an individual industry fund, what would you see as the strengths they had and perhaps the untapped strengths that they had that you could leverage off?
So there's a beautiful story I want to tell you. Some of you may know it. You may have heard it from me if you were at the conference in May, June last year. President Kennedy many years ago visited NASA. And in his visit, the first person that he encountered was a young janitor in the building. And he said to him, what do you do here? And he fully expected the young guy to say to him, you know, I help clean the toilets, or I keep the buildings neat, or something like that. And he didn't. The young guy looked at him and he said, Mr. President, I'm helping put a man on the moon. You need your entire organization reframed around its sense of purpose. You heard it in the video and from Carrie a moment ago. What do you stand for? What do you believe in? Is much more important than what do you do. Because to be frank, folks, most of what you do, somebody else does, or pretty similar, or from the consumer's point of view, not sufficiently different to be able to tell, which means you need to connect at a level that is different than the rational, the product-focused way that most of super tends to go to market. And that's branded.
Mark, but all the way along through this conference, and including in the last session, which you listened through, superannuation trustees will kind of grab you by the lapels and say, what we do is different. We are different. We invest for the long term. We're here just for the members. That's what we're about. So there's a very clear focus that that's what it is about. Is that not being reflected in the brand?
I think the truth of it is that because the category happens to behave in a particular way, i.e. you and all of your competitors, doesn't make it right. And you have, from my point of view, as you watch the banks bearing down on you and you watch legislative changes and so on, I don't mean to fill you with dread, I want to fill you with a sense of hope. You've got a chance to do something, to engage with people at an emotional level, way beyond the rational level. Very few people in this country even understand what compound interest is, let alone being able to figure out how superannuation works, and then the legislation changes the whole time. They're looking for a shortcut. We don't like to think. Human beings do everything they can to avoid thinking. And if you know System 1, System 2, and we can talk about that a little more if you like, we rely on System 1, which is, that feels right, I trust those people, they feel reputable, not a scrutiny of their performance. I'm sorry to tell you that, but that's the truth.
And Hannah, do you think that an expression of brand is not an expression of how a superannuation fund works, but a description of the values that the trustees and the organisation brings to the investment of your retirement savings?
Absolutely. I think, building on Mark's point, I think it's very easy to get locked into the functional things that your fund does differently. We all get very wrapped up in our own fund and what that means to us in the organisations, but actually forget to really connect that with what customers at the end think or know and how much they know. And realistically, it's a very small part of their, what they think about day to day. So our ability with brands is to actually shortcut that meaning for them and to say, actually, it's not about this specific product difference, it's about what we mean to them, it's about what values we bring to them. And actually, how does that affect them in their daily lives? How does it mean that we're different because actually we're going to help them get to financial well-being when they retire, not just because we've got some specific difference in how we invest. Because for the most part, they won't necessarily take the time to understand that or really have the inclination to.
And just following on from that, I think there's a big difference between, I think this industry suffers quite a bit from phone book style communication, which is, there's all your stuff about your super fund, and it's kind of incumbent on the consumer to wade through all that information to get to the part that they actually care about. And I think there's a real difference between your regulatory obligations and then your obligations to the consumer. And the two are actually very different. And I think you can find the space between the regulatory obligations that you have from a communications perspective and then fulfilling what the consumer actually wants, which is to understand why you are a fund that they should trust, why your values align, and to really take the time to communicate that to them in a short, succinct way.
So how do you figure out who they are and what they want?
I think what you want to do is you need to look at your brand, and you want to be really authentic about what you stand for. So let's just say you're a fund that believes infrastructure investment is the most important thing for Australia to be doing now to ensure its economic future, let's just say. And we're operating under a government that is, you've got the infrastructure prime minister in office. So perhaps something you want to be doing is actually saying to people, this is something that we believe in. We believe that infrastructure is important. We're going to be investing heavily in infrastructure. And if you believe the same thing too, then this is why you should be investing in our fund. That's just one example, but you've got to find a purpose that is rooted in authenticity and communicate what that is to people, because ultimately there are going to be people out there that believe the same thing and will sign on as a result.
Can I build on that for a second? And I want to address my comments particularly to the CEOs and the board members who are in this room at the minute. If you for a moment think that brand is the responsibility of marketing, you're deluded. A brand is not owned by you. And I often ask this when I'm teaching, who owns a brand? And people will tell me shareholders, or they'll tell me the parent companies that might own it and so on. And that's rubbish. Brands are owned by consumers. They exist in our memories as a bunch of feelings and a bunch of associations. And those are formed in response to the way you and your competitors behave, the way the media talks about you, the way your own employees talk about you. Therefore, you guys who are board members and CEOs, rather than ask marketing to put icing on a badly made cake, take responsibility, please, and make sure that you're reframing your organization around its central purpose, And therefore, you're enabling your employees to deliver exactly the same experience all the time, which is true to the brand, exactly like that young guy who walked into NASA every morning and he knew his job was to help put a man on the moon, or if you're a Google employee, your mission is to help organize the world's knowledge and make it available. That's it. You just need to know something dead simple like that. But then you guys as CEOs and board members, you are the only guys who can ensure that all behaviors correspond with what the brand stands for, not just the marketing stuff which is superficial, just like icing on a cake. It must be an ingredient in the cake.
I have a bit of a bone to pick there, actually, because I think if you look at CEOs of super funds as a whole, compared to, let's just say banking, and you look at Gail Kelly and people like Ian Narev, these are people who are not hiding in their office and letting the marketers do their job for them. They're people that are stepping forward, giving an opinion, moving their brand, being a little bit controversial. And it's not often enough, I think, that we see CEOs of super brands getting out there and putting out their point of view in the industry. I think there was a Deloitte survey about a year and a half ago that showed that about 80% of people's perception of a brand is directly linked to their perception of the brand's CEO. So if you think about that, I think there's a huge chasm that needs to be filled in this industry in particular of CEOs really stepping forward and saying, okay, I'm in charge of this brand, I'm in charge of what this company stands for, and I'm going to get out of my office and be willing to be a little bit exposed and a bit controversial because that will pay off for the company ultimately.
There's some great questions coming through. Just before we come to those, Hannah, can I ask, I'm fascinated by an organisation that uses everybody from people like you to neuroscientists to help people develop their brand. What do you do? Because at one level, people are being told, you've got to figure out who they are and connect with them. And then Mark says, no, you've got to figure out who you are and then connect that to them, and then you get them in there. Well, you know, chicken, egg, what?
I think a little bit, and I think a big part of maybe what gets missed in that conversation is, well, what do people need? What is it that they're looking for? What are their motivations? What's going to make the difference between a brand that says it can do something and one that actually lives up to that? And that all starts with, as Mark said, you don't own your brand. It sits in the mind of the end consumer. And that end consumer has needs, they have aspirations, they have desires for how they want to shape their future. And the more we can understand that, the better.
Do you need to understand that about the individual members of individual funds, or just how the average Australian thinks about money and retirement and so forth? Mortality, God knows what else.
I would say it's somewhere in between, probably. It's very difficult to understand every single person in isolation, but absolutely more than just a general perception of the population. Things like demographics aren't going to get you very far when actually you get very different types of people in, say, one age group. So understanding whether people are setting financial goals, how they're setting them, what sort of need they have for information and how they like to gain information is going to set you on a very strong path towards actually understanding how to talk to people better and how to interact in a way that actually makes a difference to people rather than in a way that just confuses them.
So now you're sending better emails, but you still don't have a brand.
But that's, I think, for me, that's the starting point of the brand, is the need that it fulfills and the motivations that it meets for people. And beyond that, that's about matching then what your organisation stands for with that need and how it can connect the two.
There's a question on the screen here. How do you differentiate your brand, Mark, from a super system that is not trusted by members? I remember running Talkback Radio in the middle of the GFC when Adam Spencer was sick one day, and I wondered how many other people, they didn't have a topic for me, and everybody left the control room and left the person who didn't know what they were doing sitting on air with no idea how to work any buttons except the microphone on and off, and a clock ticking slowly. And I said, I wonder if anybody like me got their envelope from their superannuation fund and has it still sitting on the mantelpiece, waiting for when they open a bottle of whiskey to calm their nerves. It's quite a good point. People remember what happened, probably more than they remember the massive rebound that occurred, a year or two later.
Absolutely. Look, I'll answer this in a little bit of a roundabout way. There was a reference earlier if you were in the plenary just after lunch, to what happened to the old blacksmiths. For those of you who haven't read it, there is a 1960 journal article you should read called Marketing Myopia by Professor Levitt, I beg your pardon, of Harvard Business School. And what he really drummed home to us was that you need to define what you're selling to people as if seen through their eyes, not your own eyes. So for all of those of you who actually think you're selling superannuation, you're wrong, you're not. Put yourself in the shoes of your customer, your end customer, and ask yourself what benefit they're actually trying to buy from you. And it is probably something like an enriched life, a better life, a sense of security. It might be any one of those kinds of things. Once you start defining your business and your output from the consumer's point of view, you're going to find yourself in a much stronger position. It's even going to help you dictate what your growth path is, how you're going to be different from the banks, how you're going to be different from other super providers, and how you're going to pull yourself out of any associations with what went on during the GFC. But you need to start, this industry hasn't needed to do much. You've been the most fortunate industry of all. Government has applied the major nudge that was required if you want behavior change language by legislating that people will create your category and spend money with you. Now, frankly, you're one of the last industries left that has felt that it can get away with not building brands, not being consumer-centric. Time's over. It's time to join the party and join the rest of the great categories that are doing a wonderful job building brands based on consumer need, based on the kind of authenticity, based on a sense of purpose and wonderful values, and that way people will go, wow, I like these people. Just can I have one more second? This is a plug for Millward Brown. You don't know that you're going to get a plug from me. If you look at your category in Australia, or you look at the life insurance category, and we look at how many people know a bit about the brands, and what we're more interested in is looking at how they transition up the hierarchy. It's almost like a Maslow hierarchy from I know a bit about you to I know a lot about you, and I'd advocate for you, and I'd forgive you if you stuff up. You know, that kind of really, really liking you, knowing a lot about you. The share of wallet implication of that is huge. Going from I know a bit about you and I know what you like rationally to I really like you trebles your likely share of wallet or share of the category sales. That's a Millward Brown piece. It's very, very robust. They've road tested it all around the world. Advertising agencies love to talk about brand, and to some of you, there's a question on the screen which says, is a brand just a snazzy logo? It sounds like, when I speak to my clients, the creative guys are just into talking about this stuff because it's touchy-feely and creative. It's not. There is an economic basis for it, and that economic basis is a trebling of your possible revenues.
David Gonski was talking yesterday morning, seems longer than that ago, in terms of how to, as a board, create a focus and a direction and some sort of teamwork. And he was talking, Kerry, and he said, write yourself a charter of who you are as a board. Yeah. Does a brand work the same, the development of a brand work the same way? Tell Absolutely, yourself who you are?
Absolutely. I think a brand is so much more than just a logo. It's how you behave, it's how you think, it's how you act, it's how you talk, but it has to be consistent. And I love this question on the board. It's, can super fun brands have a fun personality while still being respected? And the answer is absolutely. Again, if you throw back to the banking industry and you look at, say, Commonwealth Bank versus an ANZ, you've got two organizations serving essentially the same function, but one has decided to take a very highbrow, you can trust us with your money. We really know what we're doing. We're investing in Asia. This is ANZ. And then on the Commonwealth Bank side, you have a little bit more of a fun personality around CAN and technology innovation. And both are serving an absolute function and purpose in the market, and consumers are gravitating toward one or the other. But what's working both for them is that they've taken a stance and they're following that stance and they're being consistent about it. So a charter is absolutely a great place to start, particularly if it involves language about how you're going to think, what you're going to do, what you're not going to do. But then it's about following through and really making sure that you actually act on that charter. Otherwise, it's just words on a wall that kind of, you could crumple up and throw in the trash can.
If you guys are prepared to invest 17 minutes of your life and invest it well, jump onto YouTube, find a lovely little piece of film by a guy called Simon Sinek, if you haven't seen it, S-I-N-E-K, called Start With Why. And he will talk to you about the difference between the old way of building brands, which was what we do and what emotional benefit that ladders up to and so on. The great modern brands of the world are not operating like that at all. They're starting with why.
Give us some examples.
Yeah, sure. Let me give you, my favorite example is IKEA. Everybody uses Apple, and so I deliberately will not use Apple. The founder of IKEA was a man who grew up in an impoverished area of Sweden, Ingvar Kamprad. And he really felt that this was completely unjust, and he believed that everybody around him had the right to have good things. Now, it's kind of clunky because it comes almost as a direct translation from the Swedish. But the purpose, I don't want to talk about missions at all, or visions. The purpose for IKEA is to help create a better life for the many people. I unashamedly ripped that off when I was a planner on Target Australia. Every Australian has the right to stylish living. It was a rip-off of that. But the point is, and there is a question here, you know, we're pretty similar in what we do. How much do you charge
for a rip-off like that?
I only admit to it 5 or 7 years later. There's a statute of limitations or something, isn't there? The tax office only one.
It works, by the way. I mean, that's very clearly what we understand Target and increasingly Kmart to be. It's not cheap-end clothing. They're saying to us, this is the stuff you need to live, and we have it at a good price. And then when we have a fire in Bangladesh, we deal with that too.
Yeah. We would never have done Stella McCartney for Target unless we had worked out that what we stood for was bringing good things to people at a better price than they expected. And when IKEA operates, I don't know if you know this, but every designer for IKEA, before they put pen to paper, is given the final price of the item and needs to work out not just the design, not just the materials, not just the transportation, but everything that will deliver that item to somebody at a final price. So the entire organization is driven by one single-minded thought. How much easier does that make it for you when you've got hundreds of people to keep in the same place? And if you don't think that that's necessary, if you don't think you'll be found out doing what you're doing, I have 2 pairs of words for you. We talked about it earlier. Julian and Assange, or Edward and Snowden. Everything you do is known to everybody.
Even if they're not listening.
Yeah.
Hannah, talk to me about some of the work that you've done, some of the case studies that you can bring to this group about sort of defining that brand from a set of values you see before you and a client.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a nice way to think about a brand in terms of consumers is we like to think about it as a bit of an empty cupboard that we can stock. So people don't walk around with a linear, set of values that they link to a certain brand, but they have a sort of overstocked, jumbled cupboard of associations. And the clearer we can make that cupboard, the stronger our brand, essentially. So if you think about a brand like Cadbury, for example, they will probably conjure up quite similar things to you and me in terms of what we think about. So yeah, there's the chocolate in terms of the product itself, but it means a lot more to that in terms of the emotions that it brings. So it means happiness, it means sharing, it means family times. And that's a consistent message that they've been putting out for a long period of time, as Carrie talked to, that there's nothing...
So actually nothing about a milk-based sweet.
Exactly. So if you broke it down, you could get to the ingredients, but that would be a long way from actually what people associate with Cadbury. So that meaning, and the more easily that's accessed as meaning for people, the quicker the decision process. And people won't walk around in supermarkets thinking about which chocolate they're going to buy, because they know Cadbury, they know what it delivers, and that's because it's been built in their minds for consistently over a number of years.
And link between brand then back and into the culture of an organisation, because presumably nobody has any workplace bullying issues at Cadbury. It's all happy families. No, okay, so there's a distinction, right?
There's absolutely a distinction, and I think that I've probably tested that pretty recently with the acquisition by Kraft of having to actually link 2 cultures together. And I think within that, they had to sit down and say, well, what's really important to protect about this brand? What do we want to make sure people don't lose sight of as a brand? And that, for me, is the biggest, when things are changing and when the dynamics are shifting, being very clear about what you want to protect, what you want to keep owning and keep out there in people's minds is what's going to be the difference between kind of success and failure in that scenario.
Coming back to you, Kerry, what about that? What is the link between brand and culture? Because these people have a very strong culture of we put the member first and we do a better job, and we can show you over 10 years that we do a better job than the competition. We return more for our members. There's their culture. Is that their brand?
I think it's, what are you talking about? So just to take it to an example that's a little bit more closely linked with super. I did some work with ANZ's management team and with Mike Smith, so within these 4 walls. He was talking a lot about their...
That's off the record for any journalists
watching. This is off the record. He was talking a lot about their super regional strategy. And this was his platform, and he was very passionate about it, and this is what he wanted to talk about, was ANZ investing in Asia. And that's great, but as an Australian, I don't care about ANZ investing in Asia. I would like ANZ to invest in me and in Australia. So there was a huge disconnect between what he was personally passionate about and then what the brand was portraying to their consumer. So we spent quite a lot of time with him, with his management team, talking about, look, this is fine, you can talk about this, and we can see how it makes sense for the bank's long-term strategy. But what you want to do is you need to be having perhaps someone else focusing on, the Australian MD, focusing on messages that are going to the Australian audience about what are you doing for us, why do you care about Australia, and by the way, we'd really like to make sure that you actually do still care about Australia because it seems like all you care about is Asia. So I guess my point there is that you just want to make sure that whatever you're going to focus on as a brand over the long term is actually going to resonate with your audience. And I know all of the super funds will have lots of data about what their audiences care about, and you can get a lot of data these days through social media and all sorts of other feedback methods. So you just want to make sure, A, that it's authentic, and B, that it's going to resonate not just over a 3-month period, but over, say, a year and a half or 2 years or 3 years, because you can't be consistent and then change tracks halfway through.
And just a quick question on the screen that follows on from that. Do funds need to work on brand super or on the brand, their individual super fund brand?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say I would say it's a tandem approach, but you have a choice to make there. I think you can decide, are we going to talk about here's why we're making the investment choices that we are, to get back to Mark's point about the why and not the what and the how. You should not be focusing the bulk of your communication on what you're investing in, how you're investing, how you're going to generate returns. You should be focusing on why super is important, what it's going to do for you, why you care about that investment, why that investment is going to help Australians, why it's going to help Australia, why, less about what and how.
And just a quick one back to you, Hannah. What about, you was using the Cadbury example and the Kraft thing, is there a brand threat if super funds merge? What happens then?
I think there is a threat to some extent, although we have to remember how much our members know versus how much we know about that situation, and be realistic about how much they kind of want to know. But I think within that scenario, it's about working out, well, what are the commonalities between the two funds? What are the things that actually make them compatible? Why are we merging? What's the benefit to our members behind it? And I think counteracting that threat with transparency to members is really vital to protect the good things about both companies.
Okay, so Mike, you do all this work. What's the return on this? I mean, there's a question here about marketing budgets. So yes. Retail funds are going to have bigger marketing budgets if the banks come over the hills with their face painted in blue like they did in that movie with Mel Gibson. Rah! So you've done all this Braveheart. Thank you. It's very late in the afternoon. How much can you reinforce and sandbag your position by investing all of this effort, which you're talking isn't kind of storyboarding with people who were sitting on beanbags in an advertising agency, but is actually hard work about internal culture. What return do you get on that?
The return is without question. How much you have to spend is the interesting thing. Often when we speak at an event like this, I think people are secretly hoping we'll say, if you're a small fund, use public relations, and if you're a big fund, use advertising. And that is, with great respect to anybody who does think that way, that is incredibly naive. What we're really after is the power of ideas to separate us from others. And unashamedly, I'm very reluctant to kind of throw a personal plug in, right? Because that's rude and that would be diverting the purpose of this conference. But let me have a go. A couple of years ago, I worked on a brand where we put a date stamp on a pillow. Pillows are not much.
Did you do that?
Yes.
Now I throw pillows away and they fill up the bin and everything.
So pillows up until that stage weren't much differentiated from one another at all. A sea of white and a Kmart, just like a sea of superannuation funds. It's ideas that are capable of grabbing the imagination, and they need to be ideas that grab the imagination. They don't need masses of money. That was a very, very small budget. It got the Grand Prix of Effectiveness Awards largely because the budget was so small and the client allowed us to concentrate the way that the budget was spent.
But how much did you spend when you rang up the television stations and the newspapers and any other outlets on getting the message out there?
Well, you know what? The message was so compelling that it took less pushing. And I think that's what we're really looking for in this group. We're looking for ideas that really resonate with people. Most of our problem today, and this is going to be really disappointing for you, but you'll know this is true because if you reflect on your own experience, it'll feel right. You don't bound out of bed any morning thinking, I wonder what KFC is going to show me today, or I wonder what Amy will show me today, or I wonder what NAB will show me today. You don't. In fact, as humans, we try to avoid thinking and we try to avoid advertising as much as we can. Now, given the fact that most people are trying to opt out and our task is actually to entice them to opt in, you can only do that with stuff that really captures the imagination. We had a success. I have to tell you, so much of it was a fluke, even though the case study doesn't say that. Names on Coke cans. It's a tiny little idea. Come on, the first guy who said it in the room, we're going to put people's names on instead of their brand name. It sounds like it's minute. But you can take these small ideas and you can amplify them. And I promise you, I showed a piece of film at the conference last year in June in Sydney. Have a look if you get a chance. It's called The Return of Ben Ali. It's a true story. It's from our office in Tunisia, pretending that the dictator was going to return in order to get the population out of their apathy and up and voting in the first general election after the overthrow of the unpopular government. The Return of Ben Ali. Have a look at it. One single poster in one city got from a 40% participation rate up into the 80s, people who actually turned out to vote. It's possible. It's the strength of the idea. It's not the strength of the budget.
But also I think it has a lot to do with commitment. So it's great if you have the money and the budget and the balls to do really big activations. But often what we find is that we come into an organization and the poor marketing team is charged with this task of coming up with the brand's purpose. And they go through all of this work and spend all of this money, and then they say, here's what we're going to be. Here you go, Mr. CEO, Mrs. CEO. This is what we're going to do. And the CEO glances at it for 5 seconds and then goes back into his or her room, and then it totally falls flat on its face. So part of this is about if you can get commitment from your executive team, and if you can get the executive team to really promise and back that commitment, and ideally spearhead a project like a branding project, ultimately, it's actually not that difficult to find the essence of your brand. We find with most of the companies that we talk to, all of the nuggets are there. It's just that there's not very much commitment to back some of those characteristics and really put them into action and set them in stone. So I would say, you don't have to do these big, momentous activations. It can be as simple as deciding amongst yourself with your executive team, here's what we're going to be and we're going to stick to that, and getting the executive team to commit. And then all of a sudden you've got a consistent track that you're going to follow, and your members will notice and they will recognize and they will benefit from that.
And just with your burst Marcella hat on, I'll come to you, Hannah. Look, I've sat in newsrooms, and it's very easy if you have a great idea like a date stamp on a pillow to kind of get a lot of traction with that, because you need that story down the back end of the thing and everybody sleeps on a pillow and there you go. It's a lot harder to get a story up about superannuation. So to what extent are you looking to build the profile of CEOs, as you were saying before, rather than hoping to have a really sticky, cluey idea, which puts a lot of weight on people to come up with some genius thing?
Yeah, I mean, this is the bulk of the majority of the work that we do, is that journalists want to talk to CEOs. They do not want to talk to the head of marketing unless you're a major, major brand. So ultimately, it is so important that the CEO gets behind a strategy, a brand strategy, and that the CEO is trained in how to speak to media in a certain way, in an effective way, in an engaging way. You'd be shocked at how many CEOs should never be put in front of a journalist. And someone should have the guts to actually say to that person, look, you are not the right person to be representing our brand because you're an introverted, inarticulate mess. We need to have someone else be the focus of our brand, and here's who that person is. That's a whole exercise there that actually goes into that, because the person who's going to front your company needs to be someone that people respect, that people listen to.
And does that equal brand, rather than choosing the colour of a logo? Can that equal brand? For our purposes at the moment, our brand is that long-term CEO with that commitment and that internal visceral understanding of who we are and what we do.
It can. I think it absolutely can. But keep in mind the average tenure of CEOs is 3 to 5 years. So you just want to make sure that the CEO that you get to spearhead the campaign and the brand also has a strategy and a team that's going to back that up internally, because it's got to be a dual approach.
And I think increasingly in any company, brands outlive companies. You know, the brands remain in people's memories for much longer. And going back to an earlier point that Carrie was talking about, is that sort of CEO versus marketing. It's a common, common situation that we come across, is just trying to justify why we're investing, why do we need to invest in this sort of stuff. And we spend a lot of our time looking at the financial return from strong brands, looking at things like the Brandsy Top 100. And what we've seen from that is that over the sort of 10 years that we've been doing it, the strongest brands in the world outperform the stock market at all points. It doesn't matter if it's the financial crisis, it doesn't matter if things are going badly, they still outperform. And the top 10 of those have grown sort of $500 billion in the last few years. So there's this intrinsic link between financial growth and company performance and strong brands. And I think that's something that we need to make sure that we're aware of and enforcing in the company.
So here's another plug for Millward Brown then. There's a wonderful piece of work done in collaboration with Millward Brown by a guy called Jim Stengel, who used to be the worldwide CMO of Procter & Gamble. And that piece of work really does show that the organizations that are purpose-driven are absolutely killing it. And if you don't like that piece of work, which is more recent, go back to work out of Wharton Business School. There was a book published in 2007, and it was called Firms of Endearment. Grab hold of Firms of Endearment, or grab hold of the updates to Firms of Endearment. If anybody wants them, shoot me an email and I'll send you the updated stuff. But it's well worth seeing. It is the validation of organizations that center all of their behaviors around purpose and values. Now, a CEO, if he's a good fit in your organization, is going to drive forward the purpose and values of the organization. And it's going to be almost untenable if new CEOs keep changing that. That's when you break a brand. That is really when you confuse people and destroy the value that's been set up by your predecessors.
Okay, free consultation. Just bring that screen back up again for me, if you would. That one question. Thank you. I would be interested, being brand experts and also superannuation members, what would resonate with you as members of a fund, Kerry?
I think, again, I would really like to see the people that are leading these brands. I really would. I think, Mark Boris, this was about a year and a half ago, came out and said, no one has put a stake in the ground around how much money you need to save to be comfortable when you retire, and I'm just going to come out and say it, it's $1 million. And granted, I'm sure he broke all sorts of rules and regulations doing that.
And I'm sure lots of people would disagree with him, but anyway.
And lots of people would disagree with him. But he put a stake in the ground. I mean, that's not even really his sweet spot, is it? Superannuation, I don't think. But all of a sudden, all of these people were looking to Mark Boris for advice on the super industry. What a shame. He is not the person that should be talking about this. You are. So for me, I buy into people. I'm a huge Google supporter because I really thought that their last CEO was brilliant. And I switched almost everything except for my phone over to Google because I really trust their leaders. And ultimately, I think that's what I'm looking for from super brands.
Hannah, you want to grab that next?
Yeah, sure. So for me, I think it really comes down to somebody making it simple for me, and that's not to suggest that I'm completely clueless when it comes to it. But I think the easier you can make it for me in terms of the language used, the lack of jargon in terms of communication with me, the more I'm going to engage in actually what it all means. And I think that probably talks to a lot of people out there in terms of their connection with super, because often it's just, there's a lot of other things to think about, and it just becomes too hard to really do what I'm supposed to do in terms of looking at what that all means in the end.
I'm a bit selfish. I'd like you to give me the sense that I've got my person on the inside. For me, there is nothing better than an organization that genuinely, I don't mean appears to, but genuinely tries to help you to pay them less. Or something like that, acts in your own interests. That way they will enjoy my undying love. Even if they're a little bit more expensive in reality, I'll stay with them forever because I think they're looking...
Again, that's very good, that's very good. You want a sense that you've got a person on the inside. I've got Ian Silk, who just told me to stop spending money on Well, suggested I might like to stop spending money on soft furnishings at 46. He's my guy on the inside. I made the quip in the last thing and he heard it. And I mean, I don't know, I think that's probably ridiculous, but he's my guy. So you want a sense of the person on the inside.
Acting for me, not acting for the organisation. I heard on the film that was played earlier, I mean, I think it was Prue Gower talking about wanting to know where you stand on green or on the environment and so on. So you're going to find it's going to be different for everybody. And here's the truth about a brand, right? Great brands stand for something. In so doing, they're going to have people who love them and they're going to have people who dislike them. But it's a damn sight better than having people not care much at all. And so you do have to take a stand and you do have to work out what you stand for and what you believe in. And you will have some people who don't like you perhaps, or you don't resonate that well with. But for the people that you really do resonate well with, they're going to love you intensely.
And that would be your proposition, to get those people rusted on at risk of losing the people who aren't your people.
Absolutely. Because they're probably going to leave you at some stage anyway. I hope Nick Sherry's not in the room anymore, but I was working on a lot of the government advertising over the time of the introduction of the co-contribution and all of that kind of stuff. And we used to look at John Howard and think, my God, do you know, a great brand. It was at the point when he was being really poll-driven. And we were saying to ourselves, you know, you're a brand, my friend. Stand for something. That way people will know whether they can vote for you or not. But if you're going to be wishy-washy and try and stand for everything, you're going to be nothing special to anybody. And Kevin came in.
And did the same thing.
And John Howard kind of said, you know, we're an economy. Kevin Rudd said we're a society. And what do? We voted for a society over an economy. Easy.
There's another question on the screen here. Financial security and retirement is such a positive message. Why do we have such a problem selling it? Maybe that goes to your System 1 and System 2
It is
point.
a System 1, System 2 thing. You know, if you know, I'm sure that you guys are really well versed in all of the principles of behavioural science because it is really core to the kind of work that you do. But one of the principles that we know is that people will really resist a long-term gain if there's going to be any short-term loss. And there's a famous case, Dick Thaler talks about a lot, you guys probably know it, of the super fund that was created in the US, pension fund that was created in the US, which doesn't take a premium for you, but waits until your first salary increase and takes a little bit of that so you don't feel you're making any loss. Smart. You'll know that. I'm sure you know that story. So that is an understanding. That is building an understanding of behavioural economics into the construction. Now, you're luckier. You don't have to do that because government legislated that we're going to put the money into super anyway. Now, scrap for your share with other people by building your brand.
Did you want to jump on that? Can an ambassador front a brand instead of a CEO? There's a good one, Kerry.
Yeah, good question. I think the answer is yes, as long as the ambassador directly links with whatever the values are that you're going to stand for. We do a lot of work with ambassadors, and you can do a lot of testing before you engage an ambassador, because often there's a lot of expense that goes into that. But that's a great thing to do if you've got a CEO, again, who maybe isn't so engaging in front of
And so what sort of, given that you're talking about industry superannuation, who would you use for that? Would you have a representative of the nursing industry? Is there a famous nurse? Is there a famous doctor? Is that the sort of thing you'd do? This
is interesting because you would have seen this week Salesforce put Colin Powell on their board, and then you've got will.i.am working for Intel, and these are decisive decisions that these companies are making as to who they're going to align themselves with. So it will all link back to Intel is trying to be innovative, young, funky, on the cutting edge, so will.i.am really fits there, versus, say, a Salesforce that's trying to be a little bit more sophisticated, really cloud-based, secure, so Colin Powell makes much better sense than, say, a more consumery celebrity. So whoever you're going to pick, it just has to align with the values that you're going to stand for. And if you're going to be more of a fluffy, fun brand, then you want to pick somebody accordingly. And if you're going to be more sophisticated and serious, you should trust us, we're really established, we know what we're doing, then you're going to pick someone more along those lines.
Yeah, and I think the worst mistake would be to find someone that you can use and then fit things to that person just because you want to use them. So be very clear on what your values are that you want them to embody, and make sure that they do embody those values at all times before you use them.
There was a question that popped up on the Twitter feed which I was really interested in earlier. I think somebody asked the question, can you do fun, amusing stuff in a serious category? Billy Connolly worked pretty well for ING for a while. So yes, you can. Don't be afraid of using humour and of using fun characters. just make sure that there's a good brand fit with the character that you choose, and it's not just signing up any old character because they're famous. I don't think Adam Gilchrist did much for Suncorp.
And that is, it's a very expensive way to go, so just be aware of that if you're going to go down that path. It is much cheaper to use someone that's already a part of your organization and that can kind of talk the talk because they're part of the family than getting someone externally. I think there's a level of skepticism that goes with that that's a bit hard to overcome.
Okay, and we'll just wait for a couple more questions to come up. We've got about 5-7 minutes remaining here. Presumably, once you've done this business, Mark, of defining who you are, you've come up, as Kerry said, with the nuggets of who you are, you can go many ways. You know, you're kind of at the level of feeling an elephant, aren't you? That bit's, you know, a rope. You could kind of crazy go out there and say, we're cheap. And that would be true too. You know, we've got your money, we've got it under our wings, we're a chicken and we're cheap. And you could run that on high rotation and it would probably be an earworm that would get into my head that they're cheap. Or you could go some other way where you kind of try and build things that talk about integrity and all that sort of stuff. And now we're moving into the next piece that somebody put up, which is, why don't they want to know about their retirement? Don't they realise they're going to get old? No, they're 20. They don't want to think about it now. So how do you decide between the multiple things that could be reflected by who you are and what your values are, and the multiple options you have, which one's right?
If you come from... Carrie was speaking about authenticity. I think authenticity is the first place to start, because I want to tell you, the age of being able to conceal stuff is long gone. So if people are going to dig into you and try and find out more out about you, nothing will wreck a great advertising campaign faster than somebody saying, my sister works there, let me tell you what they really like. So you want a sense of authenticity. You want to use the purpose and the values to drive the culture. The first place to start is by building the brand from the inside out, making sure that the people that you hire fit that brand, that they genuinely believe in the things that the organization believes in, or they must get off the bus. They will find somewhere else that they'll enjoy working more. But build it from the inside out. Don't rely on the... I work in advertising. It's not rocket science. We don't save lives. We don't do important stuff. Leave us to last. Build it within your organization. Drive the values through the organization. Drive the behaviors in the organization. That's the key to having a sustainable brand. Make sure it's on sustainable ground, though, because cheap is not sustainable. Any monkey can duplicate that, given a few weeks and a computer.
Or any chicken. If we could go to the top of that question queue there. Should member-facing staff at a super fund have a greater public profile?
Absolutely. I think absolutely. Again, that's coming from a place of authenticity. So you just want to make sure that those people have the tools to do a good job of communicating about your brand, and that they understand what you're trying to communicate, and that they are good exhibitors of those qualities. But I'm a huge believer in using staff who work for the brand, who care about the brand, who believe in the brand, because ultimately that's really authentic. And just to piggyback off of Mark's point, I think a lot of people think that when they hire a public relations firm, they're going to get spin doctors who are going to be able to turn, you know, lies into truths about a company, but that's just, like Mark was saying, absolutely not the case. We do not lie. We do not advocate that you lie. It has got to come from a place of honesty, because if you are lying, you're going to get caught. And one of the best places to begin is with your staff, with your employees, with the people who live and breathe this stuff every day, because they're going to be really authentic, and no matter what they say, it's going to be coming from a place of genuineness.
And maybe a final question to you, Hannah, and to others who want to jump in. You've got the brand and the hype. How do you deliver on it to maintain it? Good final question.
That's a very good question. And it really is about delivering on your promises and not trying to be something you're not. You can't stand for something you don't authentically believe in or act as a company, and your members are going to be the first people to detract or defect from you if you try and do that. So I think being true to what you've said you'll deliver, and meeting all expectations in terms of those promises is how you maintain it, and it's how you make sure that the people who are experiencing it, not just hearing about it, are actually, you know, satisfied and happy with what you're delivering to them.
Final word, Mark.
Can I go back to basic principles to answer this? The brand is a reaction on my part and on your part to everything that the entity does, all of its behaviors. In fact, here's an interesting thought. There might be some things you've done to your brand without even realizing it. So when you pick up a phone and you put on hold to Telstra for 20 minutes and you don't get your question answered, you go, bloody Telstra. Well, that's their brand. And that will defeat anything they're doing in advertising and so on. So be aware that every single behavior matters, and then you're unable to separate the terms brand and hype, because what you do elicits a response. That response is the brand. Make sure that the gap between brand and hype is negligible, if any at all.
All right, a nice point on which to end. Please thank the members of the panel, Carrie Cousins, Mark Sarek and Hannah McCard.